Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel we have Dan Shappir.
Hello from Tel Aviv.
And I'm Charles Maxwood from Top End Devs. This week we're going to be talking about what's new in JavaScript. It's a new year. There's a bunch of stuff that came out last year or so. And so Dan was pointing them out to me. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Dan, I know you have a list. I don't have the list in front of me, so I will let you
I'm
just
the man
kind of
with the list.
yeah. I'll let you steer the ship, and I'll provide the color commentary.
Yeah, so it's been a while since we've spoken about what's new in JavaScript. You know, everybody's talking about what's new in frameworks, what's new in CSS, what's new in HTML. But JavaScript, you know, there was this period of time where things were coming out, you know, fast and furious. And then it seemed like everything kind of settled down. But turns out that, you know, new features are being introduced. So I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about it. We actually spoke about it a year and a half ago in episode 590. And it's interesting to contrast what has moved forward and what hasn't. So first of all, for our listeners, for anybody who may not know, there's this thing which is the JavaScript standard, but is not actually called JavaScript. It's called ECMAScript instead, which Brendan Eich, the creator of JavaScript, has likened to a skin disease. Uh, um,
It's real easy to remember too. I mean, ECMAScript just rolls
off the tongue.
Yeah.
ECMA is actually the ECMA International is a standards organization. It was originally the European Computer Manufacturers Association, but then they just decided that it's ECMA and, you know, not the credentials anymore. So why is this standard called ECMAScript rather than JavaScript? I mean, the fact that it happens to be handled by the ECMA organization should not have changed the name of the language, or at least the standard of the language. And the reason is that they don't have the copyright to the JavaScript name.
It's a trademark technically, but yes.
Yeah, it's a trademark, and it's being held by Oracle, exactly.
Yeah.
The name escaped me all of a sudden. And it's a funny story because, if, in case you know listeners don't know, they probably don't. JavaScript was created by Brendan Eich in 10 Days of Glory back in 1995 while he was working at Netscape.
Yeah.
But they were working in cooperation with Sun, which was the creators of Java, and they had this kind of cooperation where JavaScript was supposed to be the scripting language in the browser, and Java was supposed to be the actual, you know, heavy duty programming language in the browser. That didn't happen. But what did happen was that Sun ended up with the JavaScript trademark. And then
Because they own the trademark to Java.
To be honest, I'm not sure, either because of that or because that was part of the deal of their cooperation with Netscape. Either way, they ended up with a trademark, and then they were bought by Oracle. So now Oracle holds that trademark, and they've literally done nothing with it. So there's this new movement now to actually free that trademark from Oracle. They've actually reached out to Oracle. They've reached out to the governmental body that's responsible for trademarks. There's an online petition that everybody can sign at javascript.tm, fitting URL. I signed it, and I encourage our listeners to sign it, and hopefully, eventually, it will be released. This is actually being led by Ryan Dahl from Dino, who we've interviewed a few months back. So he wrote an interesting blog post about it. We can link to it. He gives the entire history and everything. I hope it's released and we can finally call it JavaScript rather than ECMAScript. But be that as it may, that's the name of the standard, and it's being handled by a committee within ECMA called TC39. And TC39.
I was going to say, if you're wondering what the cryptic name TC39, it's literally technical committee or something like that.
Exactly. It's technical committee 39. There are a whole bunch of technical committees within ECMA, and that's the number they got. And they have this whole process of how to introduce features into the JavaScript language. Originally, this process had 5 stages. Sorry, stage 0 through 4, because, well, everything should be 0 based.
Right.
But now they've actually added an interim stage 2.7. So now they have 6 stages. And to run through them really quickly, stage 0 is basically, it's a new proposal. It's not even really considered. Basically, you've had an idea and you've written down a note about it and sent it to the committee. That's more or less what stage 0 means. It's hardly anything really, but it's the starting point for all proposals in that are processed by the committee. When the committee decides to actually look at a particular proposal, it moves to stage 1. That means that that proposal is under consideration. The committee expects to devote time examining and identifying the need for that proposal, what it's supposed to address or improve or fix, and basically compare it to other alternative solutions that might exist and decide whether it's worthwhile to pursue. They need to identify somebody to champion that proposal. They expect an outline to be written and discuss algorithms and abstractions and semantics and so forth, all the good stuff. So that's stage 1. Stage 2 is when the committee has chosen a preferred solution or maybe a few solutions in a particular solution space, but the design is very much still a draft and may change significantly before it's actually introduced into the language. The committee actually expects something to be developed and eventually introduced into the language. They're just not absolutely sure what it is yet and how exactly it's going to look. And at that point, they expect obviously the thing to be much better documented, and for people to start experimenting with it and actually have something real to examine. Now they've introduced a new stage called 2.7 because they didn't want to move stage 2 or stage 3, and they wanted to put something in between. So stage 2.7 means that the proposal is approved in principle and is currently undergoing validation. That means that maybe a browser manufacturer has put it behind a feature flag, or maybe there's a Babel plugin or something, like somebody's playing with it, experimenting it, and you can start seeing how it actually works and whether it actually feels like a good idea. Stage 3 is when the proposal has been recommended for implementation and no changes to the proposal are expected. In other words, they feel pretty confident that this is how it's going to be, but it's not yet part of the standard, and therefore backward compatibility is not yet required, which means that if somebody comes up with a better idea or they suddenly discover a problem with it, they can backtrack. So they can even move it back to stage 2 or even 2.7, something like that. And finally, you've got stage 4, which means that the proposal is feature complete and is ready to be included in the standard. Essentially, it means that it's effectively part of the standard. It's just that a new standard document has not yet been released. One is released once a year. So proposals that are complete wait at stage 4 until they are included in the next release standard. And usually by the time they're in stage 4, you actually find them implemented in browsers and you can actually start using them. So far, so good?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny too, because you're talking about this process and two things are going through my head. And one is, it sounds complicated, but yeah, I mean, if you really think about the progression, it all makes sense, right? The other thing that's going through my head is I'm we're currently heading into a legislative session in the state of Utah, and so I've been going through the process that bills go through to get passed, and I'm sitting here going, wow, this is in some ways simpler and in some ways more complicated than the political
Well,
process.
in
So
certain ways, it has to be because
yeah,
unlike the political process, these kind of standards are really set in stone. When
yes,
something is added into JavaScript, it can never really be removed,
yeah,
which means that we had better be really certain about adding it into the standard. And you've got, like I said, you've got the browser manufacturers on this committee, and they've got to really approve it and say, this is something that we can actually implement. Somebody might have
right.
this great idea, but implementing it would turn JavaScript on its head. Then obviously the browser manufacturers will push back and won't approve it.
Yep.
So let's put it this way, the attitude is better safe than sorry, and that's a good attitude to have in the context of language standards, especially a language like JavaScript, where, as I said, once something is added, it can never be removed.
I really wish that our legislators would do better safe than sorry. Let's think a little more deeply about this before we pass it or not. Right.
Yeah.
Anyway. But yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's good context that JavaScript has always gone way out of its way to be backward compatible. I'm sure there's some times where there was just something that they had to kind of roll back, but
Actually, the one time that I can think of where effectively things were rolled back was when they introduced strict mode. And even then, they rolled them back by introducing strict mode. So if you're running outside strict mode, they're still there. They wanted
Mhm.
to roll back, for example, the with keyword, and I won't get into the details of why. It turned out to be a bad idea in the context of the JavaScript programming language, but they couldn't remove it. And so instead, they kind of rolled it back by making strict mode more and more the common way in which JavaScript worked.
Mhm.
And in strict mode, with does not exist.
Right. Yeah,
And
and if you're wondering if you're newer to JavaScript and you're saying what is strict mode, don't worry about it. You're using strict mode.
yeah, just so we mentioned it, so we might as
Yeah.
well provide details. You can explicitly enter strict mode by having the use strict string at the top of a scope or the top of a file. You can't actually ever exit strict mode. You only enter strict mode. And you enter strict mode by default in ECMAScript modules. So if you implement a module, it's strict mode by
Mm.
definition. In HTML, that's if you have a script tag with a type equals module, it's strict mode by default, and then you can do module things like imports and stuff like that. You're also strict mode by default in classes because, again, classes are kind of a new type of a scope, and it makes sense to be strict by default inside classes.
Yeah, I think most people working within the context of JavaScript, though, they're working under some system that puts them in strict mode without them
Yeah,
doing it.
because hopefully they're building ECMAScript modules these
Yeah,
days.
yeah. So your React projects or whatever other framework or library you're using generally use modules, and so you're generally put into this box anyway.
And I really can't think of any other occurrence where something was effectively removed out of JavaScript.
Mm.
So, it's interesting.
Yep.
Anyway, so let's talk about a couple of these enhancements and proposals. But before we dive into them, it's really worthwhile to highlight the fact that none of them really significantly, or maybe even at all, change the JavaScript syntax or semantics. So you've got nothing new like the arrow function syntax
Mm-hmm.
or let or const or stuff like that, which really changed the way that JavaScript kind of worked. Well, there is one towards the end, but it's still at stage 3. and we'll see if we make it all the way to that one. But all the rest are better described as being part of a quote unquote JavaScript standard library. They've added new object types and new methods or functions that are built in that you can use instead of, let's say, importing some NPM module that would implement them. So
Yeah.
we've got more standard functionality being provided out of the box by the JavaScript runtime environment itself, be it the browser or be it Node or whatever.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that if you're using these, you may already be using these features. They're just now the official standard kind of stuff.
Yeah, you might have. There's a good chance that you might have imported such functionality before. Now it's built in and you don't need to import it anymore. Kind of
Right.
like the browser started providing fetch as a built-in function, and you didn't need something like an Axios anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the first one I would like to mention is something that's actually 5 years old. It's from ES 2020, and it's called promise.allSettled. And as its name implies, it waits for all the provided promises to be settled. Now, it's very common when working with promises to need to wait on a couple of promises simultaneously, effectively in parallel. And when most developers need to do that, I see most of them reaching out for promise.all and just using promise.all. But what they might have not considered is the fact that promise.all short circuits on a rejected promise. So promise.all receives an array of promises and it waits in parallel on all of them. It returns a promise that resolves when all the provided promises resolve. But if even one of those promises reject, then the return promise immediately rejects.
Mm.
And that may not be what you're looking for. It may be, but it may not be. Sometimes you actually want to wait on all the promises provided until they are all of them either resolved or rejected. In other words, all of them are settled, and hence the name of the method, all settled.
Right. So let me see if I can restate this in a different way. So if you do promise.all, yeah, if one of them rejects, you get rejected. But it doesn't. Yeah, but it doesn't tell you that they've all finished waiting for whatever it is that they're waiting for. And so effectively the all settles, it does more or less the same thing, but if you have one of them that's still waiting for whatever, whether it's going to reject or fulfill or anything else.
So think about a simple scenario. Let's say you have two promises. Let's say even three promises.
Mm-hmm.
And you pass the array of the three promises into promise.all. Let's say the first one resolves. That's great. And then then the other two are still pending.
Right.
And then the second one rejects, then it will immediately return with a reject. It won't wait on the third one to either resolve or reject. And it won't also tell you that the first one resolved. It will just tell you that, hey, this thing rejected.
Okay.
Whereas with promise all settled, what you get back is an array of objects. First of all, it waits on all three. So even if the second one rejected, it will still continue to wait until the third one completes. And then it will return an array of objects. And each object has a field that indicates whether or not it resolved or rejected.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to have this open and I forgot.
I just posted a link to MDN, and
MDN is always
there.
MDN is always the best. So it basically returns an array of objects, one per each promise, Each element of those arrays is an object and it has a property called status, and that
Mm-hmm.
status could be either fulfilled or rejected. If it's fulfilled, then it will have a field called value with the resolved value. And if it was rejected, it would have a field called reason with the appropriate rejection reason. So
Yeah.
this way you can look at all the promises and see whether they resolved or rejected and what they actually returned. And as
Now,
I said, in a lot of cases, that's actually what you want
mhm.
rather than just promise.all. But a lot of people are not familiar with it and use promise.all when they should have actually used promise all settled.
So MDN makes it look like, because it calls promise dot all settled, you pass in the array, and then it calls dot then. So does it operate as a promise as well?
Yeah. It returns a promise that resolves to that array of objects.
Right. Yeah, I just wanted to, clarify, because you said it returns that, but it does it's a promise that resolves to that array of
Yeah, of course,
things, and
because
so because it
exactly,
has to wait for everything to finish.
exactly.
That's cool. So I'm going to ask another question that's not about all settled, but you said this is from 5 years ago. So when you say that we're talking about new things in JavaScript, are these things that are now generally implemented, or are these just things that, hey, these have passed in the last however long and people ought to know about them, or what's your criteria for making the list?
Well, first of all, this is the oldest one. Everything else
Right.
that I'm going to be talking about is newer than that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I guess my criteria was relatively new things that our listeners might not have known
Okay.
about. Now, I think that things that are actually already part of the standard are generally much more interesting than things that are not yet part of the standard. I mean,
Right.
things that are not part of the standard might be really cool. Usually, they often push the envelope a lot more, which is one of the reasons that the committee is kind of hesitant about adding them actually into the language. But I think that when you've got a functionality that can actually be used and provides real value, that's
Mm-hmm.
more pertinent, let's say, than some pie in the sky that might never actually arrive.
Right. So these are probably just hidden gems that you may not have known got added to the language over the
Exactly.
last.
And like over the last 5 years, I
Yeah.
guess.
Okay.
The next one is from ES 2022. So it's almost 3 years old. And it's the .at method on arrays, strings, and typed arrays. And you basically give it an index and you get back the item. So it's really like using the square brackets in a lot of ways. And you might ask yourself, well, why do I need it? Why don't I just use the square brackets? And the reason is that you can also provide it with negative numbers and then you're indexing from the end. So if you do .at on an array and pass in -1, you're looking at the last element in the array.
Interesting.
Now, that's actually how various other programming languages actually work. So, in other programming languages, you might have been able to have the indexes in the square brackets themselves, but you can't do that in JavaScript because that's not how named properties work in JavaScript. And in JavaScript, you could legally have a -1 property, so you couldn't
Yeah.
use that. Um, and the funny thing is that this negative indexes actually worked with the dot slice method for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
but then it would always return an array.
Right.
And with dot at, you get that actual element from the array, which is just nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've used other languages that do this with their arrays. So, but they do it with the square brackets, and yeah, you're explaining why you couldn't do that and maintain backward compatibility with JavaScript. But yeah, this is really cool. I like that.
Um, Another one that's more of a you should use and probably don't is object.hasOwn. Are you familiar with the hasOwn property method?
No.
So in JavaScript, there's the in operator, which tells you whether or not a property exists in an object. Objects
Mm-hmm.
in JavaScript kind of work like property bags, and you can check to see whether a particular string is the name of a property in an object using the in operator. But the in operator also looks up the prototype chain. So it
I was
doesn't
going to
only
say this is cool. I just looked it up, and yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
now has own property has existed forever as a way to check whether a property name exists in an object
Mm-hmm.
without going up the property chain. The problem with has own property is that not all objects necessarily have it, because you need to have the object prototype in your prototype chain to actually have it, and it's not there by definition. So you
Right.
might try to use has own property only to have it break, because your object doesn't actually derive from object prototype.
Mm-hmm.
So the safer way is to do object.hasOwn as this kind of a global method, static method, and the first parameter is the object you want to test, and the second parameter is the name of the property you want to check.
Right.
So it's just a safer way. So the preferred way to check whether or not a specific object has a particular property is not using has own property, which is what most of us do, but rather using object.hasOwn. Yet I don't recall ever seeing code actually work like that. So
Right.
yeah.
So if you've this, for example, could tell you if you've overridden a property, right? You've written your own function for,
A lot of people
tutoring
use
or whatever.
yeah, a lot of people use JavaScript objects as dictionaries.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, I think they should be using the map object type, but a lot of people still like using simple objects because it's easy to convert to from JSON and so forth. And you want to check whether, let's say, a certain property exists in a JSON object or not. So you might check it using has own property. You should actually check whether or not it exists using has own.
Mm. Gotcha.
So those are two things that were added almost 3 years ago in ES 2022. .at and object has own. Um, Relatively new, I guess. Mostly not so much used, but they're there and they're useful.
Yep.
And I guess people should be using them more. Moving on, ES 2023. Um, Here's a nice one that a lot of people, I think, might like. And this is find last on arrays. Sometimes you want to find the last element matching a particular thing rather than the first. Now, obviously, you can do reverse and then find, but why reverse the entire array when you can just do find last?
Nice. It's funny because I'm looking at the uh oh, it does have find last in here, but it also had find last index of, which I guess is related but not the same.
Yeah, find and find last return the
Mm-hmm.
actual value. Find index of and find last index of return the index of the found element.
Right. And this finds a matching element, right? So you can pass it a function, and you can say if this returns true on the element, then
Yeah, let's say you have an array of numbers and you want to find the first one bigger than 42.
right,
So you can pass in a function that compares the x, you would
right,
do x
greater
arrow
than
x
42. Yeah,
exactly. And with regular find, you would find the first element greater than 42. With find last, you simply find the last item greater than 42.
yep,
And and like I said, usually what people would do is that they would reverse the array. And it's kind of silly to need to reverse just to find the last one.
right.
Speaking about reverse, The next things that I wanted to mention that came out in 2023 are the change array by copy. Again, talking about things that were in JavaScript that are a bit unfortunate but cannot be fixed because backward compatibility. We have certain methods that modify arrays in place. So, for example, if you do dot reverse on an array, it reverses the array in place. Likewise, if you do dot sort, it sorts the array in place. And that's not how we want to work in a more quote unquote functional world. I guess they did it back in 95 because for efficiency's sake to avoid the extra locations. But you really, it's you really want to avoid methods that modify objects in place if you can avoid it.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did is they introduced an well, not an alternatives to these methods that create a copy. So instead of reverse, there's this new dot to reversed.
Mm-hmm.
And to reverse does not modify the original array. Instead, it returns a new array which is reversed. Likewise, you've got the dot to sorted, which again sorts an array, but rather than sorting in place, returns a new sorted copy.
Right.
Um, and you should be using these. There's absolutely no reason. What I used to see are people copying the array by doing a dot slice and then doing a reverse on the copied array,
Mm-hmm.
and now they can just do two reversed or two
Yeah.
sorted.
Yeah,
There's
it makes sense.
also there's also a two spliced reminder splice, unlike slice. It can be used to replace to delete parts of an array and replace parts of an array. Two spliced does that, but instead of modifying the original array, again returns a modified copy.
Yep. There's also a two sorted.
Yeah,
Um,
I mentioned already the two
oh,
sorted.
yep. And then there's
Uh,
dot width is the other
yeah,
part of the.
yeah, the dot with is confusing because it's kind of not two something. So where did this come
Mm-hmm.
from? Dot with is like dot at, but it modifies the copy. So it
Right.
modifies a particular item. With dot at, you could change the value of a particular item. With dot with, you give an index and a new value, and it creates a copy where that particular element, with that index has the new value. So you might have an array, let's say, with 1, 2, 3. You do dot with 1, comma 42. So it will become 142, 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you on this should be your default way to move through arrays. Um, I mean, we run into these problems all the time where you inadvertently change something that you didn't intend to. And so by doing things in this way, you'll avoid those issues unless you explicitly want to be changing that for a real good reason.
Exactly. And especially because in JavaScript, when you pass arrays into functions or methods, you're passing the reference to the array.
Right.
So you're actually um, passing the reference to the original array. And if that method then or function then calls dot reverse on the array that was provided to it because it needs a reverse copy for some reason, but use reverse instead of to reverse, it not only modifies the array for itself, but also for whomever called it,
Right.
which is totally unexpected behavior in most cases.
Yep.
So yeah, for sure. Going forward, always use to reversed instead of reverse, to sorted instead of sorts, to spliced instead of splice, and dot with whenever that makes sense. Um, Continuing to move up the calendar, we are now in 2025. Let's look 1 year back, 2024. We also got a couple of things. We got top level await, and by top level, it means top level of a module. So if you're creating an ECMAScript module, you can have await outside of a function body. In the past, you could only use awaits inside async functions. Now you can actually use awaits outside, but at the global scope, as it were, but only inside modules. You might use it to maybe import some sort of a do some sort of dynamic module import, or maybe get some configuration file or something like that. So you might want to do a fetch in order to get some configuration or something like that. But you really need to be careful with top level awaits because they block the module load. So if you've got one module importing a submodule, and that submodule does a global await, then it blocks the module that imports it until that promise resolves. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a really good example on the proposal itself, and I posted a link to that, the TC39 proposal, where essentially what they're doing is they're running the await within a function that's kind of so you create a function and then you call the function is effectively what you're doing with the await in it. That's an async function, and they've done it with an immediately invoked async function, as well as just a named function that they call that's an async function. But yeah, I can see where this could be a foot gun, where you could shoot yourself in the foot doing this.
Yeah, for sure.
But I can also see the utility in it, right? It's like, in order for this module to do anything useful, I have to have this other thing.
Yeah, without this data, I can't do anything.
Yeah.
So I really need to wait on that data before I can actually even finish loading.
Right.
But again, you should definitely be really careful about using top level awaits inside your actual code.
Yeah, I definitely have a reason to be doing this.
The next ones I want to mention, and they're really useful functions and have been available in a lot of other languages and are provided by libraries like Lodash, is object.groupby and map.groupby. Let's start with object.groupby. With object.groupby, you provide an array of stuff and a function that you invoke it. On a collection of items, and you also provide a callback function which returns strings that describe each item in the sequence, and then it groups the items based on the string value. It's kind of difficult to explain, but very often we want to take a collection of stuff and group those things according to what they are. So for example, I might have like different types of different objects in an array, and they also all of them have, let's say, a different type, which is a string. So I can group them according to the value of their type property, and have return one array of all the objects of one type, another array of all the objects of another type. It's instead of having to filter again and again and again, I can do it in one go.
Yeah, this is something that I use pretty frequently in other languages as well. But and there's a really good example on the MDM doc that I just posted. But yeah, I mean, they give a list: asparagus, bananas, goat, cherries, and fish. They all have a type property of vegetable, fruit, or meat. And then it tells it to group by type, essentially. And I'm not going to read the syntax for you. You'll have to go look at it because it's hard to just read out. But yeah, then it gives back an object that has properties of vegetables, fruit, and meat, and it's shoved those objects up underneath that. So It makes it really easy to, like you said, not have to iterate over it a zillion times if you're just sorting things or handling things based on their type.
Exactly. Now, the only difference really between object.groupBy and map.groupBy is whether or not the result is an object with the various fields or a map with the various entries. Some people would prefer to work with a map. Some people would prefer to work with an object, so they can use either object.groupBy or map.groupBy. But the algorithm is essentially exactly the same.
Yeah, it's interesting too because on MDM for map.groupBy, it hands it an array for the things that and it has the same list of things actually as object.groupBy, but it hands it an array for the thing that it's sorting, and yeah, it just gives back a map instead. So kind of interesting there.
Now, the final one that I want to mention is one that's going to make a lot of our listeners kind of groan, because a lot of people have really wanted something like that and have written a lot of boilerplate code to effectively implement this functionality. And so it's kind of nice to have it now built in out of the box. But on the other hand, I'm kind of worried that people will abuse it or misuse it. It's promise dot with resolvers. When we create a promise, only the promise can kind of resolve or reject itself. So you do new promise, you pass in a function to the constructor with resolve and reject, and that function and the promise constructor invokes that function, and only that code has access to the resolve or reject. You can't resolve or reject a function, a promise, sorry, from the outside. Now, what people do when they do want to be able to resolve or reject a method promise from the outside is then they actually copy resolve and reject into global variables outside the promise scope, and it kind of feels wonky. Are you following what I'm trying to describe?
Not entirely.
Let's say I have a promise, but I want to have some sort of an external event resolve it.
Mm-hmm.
So I do a new promise, and I pass in the function that gets the resolve, but I can't resolve it from inside the promise. I want to have just an access to that resolve to resolve it somewhere else. So I,
Okay.
I copy the reference to the resolve and hand it over to somebody else, and then that somebody else can resolve me.
Okay. Sounds complicated, but I think I understand. Let me see if I can restate it just so that I get it. So, I have a promise. For whatever reason, I'm not going to use the default, dot then to resolve, or dot. What are the other ones, like dot error or
No,
whatever?
you're not. It's not exactly correct. Let's say you've got you do a new promise, and you
Uh huh.
pass in a function with resolve and that gets resolve and reject, and then
Okay.
you take the resolve and put it in window.resolve, and you take the reject and you put it in window.reject. Now you
Okay.
can call window.resolve to resolve that promise.
Uh huh.
So you're copying that resolve method out of the promise into somewhere else. In the case I just gave, it's effectively into a
To
global.
make it in a global, yeah.
But you can also copy it into a local variable in a scope. But you're just
Okay.
copying it out of the promise. And
Okay.
I've seen a lot of instances where people needed to do that for some reason. They want to they have a promise, but they want to be able to just resolve it from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of why you would need to do this, but
um, there are good examples in the MDN, but I've seen a lot of examples of such thing. I've even seen example of something like that within React's on code when they
mm-hmm.
implement when they kind of throw promises to in order to implement suspense. So it's implemented by throwing promises, and you need to be able to resolve those promises from the outside. So they also kind of hold on to the resolve and reject of the promises on the outside of the promise itself.
Okay.
So with resolvers actually does that for you in a kind of built-in way. Instead of returning a promise, it returns an object that has three properties. A property called promise, which is the promise, a property called resolve, which is the resolver function, and a property called reject, which is the rejector function.
Okay.
So, and you can destruct the return value and basically get the promise, get the resolver, and get the rejector.
Right.
So in cases where you need this kind of functionality, and as I said, I've seen this pattern used a whole bunch of times, it's now much easier and cleaner to do it because it's built into the language itself.
Okay. So from what because I'm looking at the proposal as well now. So essentially what you do is you do promise with resolvers, and it deconstructs the promise so that you just have references to the promise, resolve, and reject as functions or objects. And then you can
promise is an object, and resolve and reject
right,
are functions.
right.
Exactly.
And so then what I can do is I can basically reference those wherever I need. So if I have something else that needs to resolve or reject the promise, it
can just call resolve or reject directly.
Yeah, it can just do it without having to do work some magic on the promise object to get at the internals or something like that.
Exactly. So it's a convenience method. You can definitely write the code yourself, but it was just really ugly boilerplate code. I've seen it done lots of code bases that I've looked at, and it's nice to have a cleaner alternative, but you should have a good reason to use it rather than use the regular promise semantics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because you were talking about people having implemented it, and on the TC39 proposal, it's like existing implementations, and it shows where React did it, and Vue did it, and Axios did it, and TypeScript did it, and Vite did it, and Dino did it. So,
exactly. And so now it's built in, and there's no reason for any of them to actually do it themselves.
Yep, makes sense.
Okay, now we're kind of done with things that are already actually in the language. Let's look at things that are not yet officially part of any standard, but are stage
these are
4.
They are stage 4.
Which means that they are effectively part of the standard, just that the relevant standard has not been released yet. Now, funnily enough...
Hang on, so what does that mean? It means that they've adopted the proposal, but they haven't rewritten the ECMAScript standard to include them yet?
Exactly. They release the standard once a year, so they'll release ES 2025 sometimes later this year, but these things are kind of waiting for that document to be released.
I gotcha. So people might be furiously working away at them now because they know what's
they're actually, all of them are actually, the ones that I'm going to mention are actually implemented in browsers.
Oh, okay.
But they're not, because from the browser manufacturer's perspective, they've arrived.
Right.
So why wait for the document if we know that they are going to be part of the document?
Makes sense. Extra credit to the browsers.
Yes, indeed. The funny thing is that I've actually mentioned them in that episode 590 a year and a half ago. Only then they were stage 3. So it took them a year and a half to progress to stage 4.
Yeah, but again, I like that they're being deliberate about it. So
yeah, for sure. So the first one are set methods. Do you know the set object type in JavaScript? Have you used it?
No.
Set is kind of like the set in math. It's basically a collection type.
Oh, yes.
Where something can either be part of the set or not part of the set.
I thought you were talking about like a method on object or something called set object type, but no, the set. Yeah,
Yeah,
I've
you
used
do
this
new
before.
set. Exactly. New
Yeah.
set, you pass in an array of stuff to the constructor, and then those things are in the set, and you can check whether something is in the set or not.
Mm-hmm.
You can add more stuff to the set or remove it from the set. But it's basically just to check if something is a part of
Right.
a collection or not. And the thing is, like as I alluded, set is really similar to set in math, and there are a
Mm-hmm.
whole bunch of operators that you can apply on sets in math, and it makes sense to have them on sets in JavaScript as well. So you've got, for example, union, which can take two sets and return a new set, which is the union of those two sets, so that it contains all the items that are in each one of them. Now it's a union rather than a concatenation,
Mm-hmm.
because everything is in a set either 0 or 1 time.
Right.
So if it's a set of 1, 2 and another set of 2, 3, and you do a union, you get a set with 1, 2, 3.
Right.
Likewise, you've got dot intersection, which can create an intersection of two sets, or dot difference, which returns a difference between two sets. And these whole bunch of methods that have been introduced to sets, and just makes working with sets, like working with mathematical sets, much cleaner and easier. I assume that there was probably more than one package on npm that implemented all this functionality. It's pretty straightforward to implement, but now it's built in, so you don't need those npm packages anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense because typically when you're using because other collection types, dictionaries or arrays, you're usually using those to hold all your data. And like you said, I like the way you put it, where it's like the mathematical set. So this is, you typically use sets for certain types of operations. And so if you need a friendly and easy way to do those kinds of operations, you can use sets.
Exactly, that's what sets are for. So it's really nice to have those methods now built into the JavaScript programming language. It's not like this big revolution. It's not like arrow
Right.
functions or like let or const, but it just makes JavaScript a nicer language out of the box.
Yeah. So sets are a new addition. They didn't.
Well, sets have been here for a long time. Sets
Right.
were introduced with maps, I think, way back in ES. What's called ES6 or ES 2015. So they've
Uh-huh.
been here for like a decade. But it's nice to have these operations on sets now part of the standard.
Okay.
As I said previously, you had sets, but if you wanted to do these an operation like union, you would have kind of needed to implement it yourself. And it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
difficult. You could spread the set into an array, then concat the two arrays, and create a new set out of them.
Right.
And you would get the union, but a whole bunch of copying going on. So
Right.
now you've got a cleaner, more efficient implementation,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly an alternative to bringing in yet another NPM package.
Right.
The other thing that was stage 3 and now is released, and it's a bit more difficult to explain, are sync iterator helpers. So we've had episodes in the past, way back in 2021, where I talked for 2 whole episodes about iterators and why I think they're great. And I think I might have been able to convince AJ for the duration of the episode, and then he immediately changed his mind once that episode was over. Those were episodes 468 and 469 for those who are interested in the details of what iterators are and how they work. Um, I won't go into too much detail. Basically, it means that we now have methods like map or filter or reduce on iterators like we have them on, let's say, arrays. And the easiest way to explain how to use them is think of, let's say I have an array of stuff, and I would do array dot, let's say, map, and then dot filter, and then dot
Mm-hmm.
uh, reduce or something like that. Now I can wrap the array itself in something that in something. It's iterator dot from. So I do iterator with a capital I dot from on the array, and then on the return value from that I do the dot map dot filter dot reduce, etc. Now you might ask yourself, why would I do that, and what's the difference? So first of all, it returns an iterator that, rather than an array. So if I then want to actually get an array and result as a result, I need to actually spread it into the result into an array. So you say, hey, this is actually even more work. I needed to add an iterator from on the original array and then spread the result into an array. And what's the upside of all this? Why would I want to do all this stuff? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, iterator.from is not just for arrays, it's for anything that's iterable. So it means that if I now have a new collection type, so for example, maps or sets in JavaScript, they're collections. They actually implement the for each, but they don't implement a filter. They don't
Hmm.
implement a find. They don't implement a reduce. They don't implement a filter. So uh, how do I invoke those methods on those types of collections? What I would usually see people doing is either avoid using these collections if they needed these methods, or alternatively copy them into arrays. And if you're going to copy them into arrays, then you might as well have just used arrays. So now I can apply iterator from to anything that supports iterators, any collection type that supports iterators, and then I can use all these methods on that collection. So that's advantage number one. I don't need to implement those methods directly on each and every collection type. I just need to implement iterators in the collection, and then I can use these methods on any collection type, be it a built-in collection or one that I implement myself. Okay, so that's advantage number one. Okay,
Hmm.
the second advantage is that it avoids all the intermediate arrays. When you do dot map on an array, you get as a result an
Another
array
array.
of the
Yep.
mapped. So when you do dot map, dot filter, dot whatever, you're getting a whole bunch of intermediate arrays that you're copying stuff from one to the next to the next to the next and so forth. With iterators, they don't create those intermediate arrays. They work by doing lazy evaluation. You just get the results that you need. Only the computations that are required without all the intermediate arrays. So they can actually be a lot more efficient in cases where you don't need all the values.
Right.
And I'm really happy that they're here because iterators have been kind of a dud feature in JavaScript because they lacked all these helper functions. Hopefully now maybe they'll get some more love from the JavaScript developer community. Time will tell. Maybe it's too late. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah. So these are the async iterator helpers, right?
No, these are the sync iterator helpers.
Oh,
The
just the
sync
iterator
iterator,
helpers.
the sync iterator helpers are here. They exist in browsers. You can already do iterator from inside Chrome, inside Safari,
Okay.
inside Firefox. But what we don't have yet are async iterator helpers. They're stuck in stage two, I think.
Yes, they are. This one says it's stage 4. So
Yeah, the sync ones are stage four. The
yeah,
async ones are stuck in stage two. They've been stuck there for a whole while. That's really unfortunate. Again, what's the
yeah, that
difference
looks
between?
really helpful.
Yeah, and if our listeners are interested in the difference between sync iterators and async iterators, they should listen to episode 469, where I explain the
Yeah.
difference in detail. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which is kind of here, are JSON modules. You can now import not only JavaScript, you can import JSON.
I'm sorry, say that again.
You know the JavaScript import command?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can now import not only JavaScript modules, you can import JSON files. And the result of the import is the JSON object.
Oh, cool.
You just need to tell the import that you're importing a JSON. You basically tell it, you assert that this is the type of what you're importing. Is that
Yeah.
kind of clear?
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm just trying to find an example on the internet, but that makes
You
sense.
you do you do import JSON from something.json, and then at the end of that instruction you add with open curly brackets type colon JSON close curly brackets. So
Oh, okay. Yeah.
theoretically in the future we might have other types. I don't know, maybe we'll import CSS or text files or I don't know what.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, we've got it for JSON. Now, why is this useful? Because I mean, you could just do a fetch and then
Yeah.
do a JSON parse. Why do we need to import? Um, to be honest, it's more of a convenience than a necessity. But the convenience is that in a lot of cases, we use JSON as configuration. And it's really useful to be able to directly import such configurations into the code.
Yep.
Think about, I don't know, a Webpack configuration or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're creating some sort of node-based utility, and that utility uses some sort of JSON configuration, and now you can just import that configuration at the top of your file and then just use that configuration, because if that
Right.
configuration is missing, there's really nothing that you
No.
can do.
Yeah.
And it also works with dynamic imports, by the way.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, it's again, it's not earth shaking, but it's really useful, I think, and it's nice to have it built into the language.
Yeah.
And it's now
Well,
it's stage 4, so that means that it's here.
yeah. The way I think about it is you import all the things that are required to run your application, and yeah, typically that's going to be other JavaScript files. But yeah, it makes sense, right? That you may have some setup data or whatever that you need in order for it to work. And so it's another requirement. It's just not code.
Exactly. It's a declarative way to load your configuration data
Mm-hmm.
into your code,
Yep.
basically. And you can be uh, certain that if that configuration fails to load, then your code fails to load. And if it successfully loads, then your code then gets to run with that configuration. It kind of
Mm-hmm.
blocks on that configuration. It doesn't proceed until that configuration is loaded. So it's not like I'm loading some configuration asynchronously. I need to wait for it or write code that waits for it or something like that. I can just import it and use and rely on the fact that if I load it successfully, it means that I have this configuration data.
Yep. Also, for
Um,
the iterator conversation, I did post episode 469 just so that people can go reference that if they want to.
yeah, basically they probably want to listen to both 468 and 469
Yeah.
together, to be honest.
Yep.
Since we're running short on time, I want to mention just one stage 3 standout. It's being stage 3. It means it's not yet here, so don't go try to use it. But there are various existing ways for you to actually test the implementation, either npm modules that implement it, or Babel plugins or something like that. It's the temporal object or temporal namespace. Actually, it's a more accurate way to put it. We all know that the JavaScript date object is pretty bad. It has a lot of problems and limitations with it.
I've
For
done hand-to-hand combat with it before, and I have lost some of those battles.
Yeah, there are problems around working with time zones with it. It only really
Yeah.
supports your own time zone, um, and doing all sorts of daylight saving time computation is really challenging, and it's mutable, which makes it really problematic. It was created back in 1995 based on the then Java date object. Java actually fixed their date object, but in JavaScript you couldn't for backward compatibility reasons, so we're stuck with it.
Hmm.
So temporal aims to fix these problems by providing an alternative to date. So date will still be there because obviously you can't take something away, but now instead you can use temporal, and by using temporal, you'll avoid the need for stuff like Moment.js and other npm modules, which aim to fix a lot of the time problems that we face when we need to deal with date and time in JavaScript.
Yep.
It supports non-Gregorian calendars for people who care about these things. For example, the Hebrew calendar. You've got more date format parsing options, so on and so forth. Just adds a whole bunch of functionality for dealing with date and time in JavaScript. Now, as I said, unfortunately, it's still stuck in stage 3. I guess it's really complicated to get everything right in such a complex domain. So they're taking their time. Hopefully, we'll get it
Hmm.
eventually.
Yeah, I was going to say, as fraught as time and time zone and all of that stuff gets, and it's not just JavaScript. I know that we have some listeners that are kind of polyglot folks, so they work on the back end in Ruby or Rust or Go or something, right? And so you folks know that, hey, some of this stuff is maybe easier in that language, but it's still hard sometimes. And then the folks that only do JavaScript, like this is it's a hard problem. And so yeah, I understand why they may be uh working through some of the finer details to make sure that they get it right. Because yeah, if they put in an implementation that really does kind of just shine, I mean that's a big area of pain that a lot of people have to deal with. Now, you said it's stage 3, so is it implemented or somewhat implemented or partially implemented in
Uh,
browsers?
no, it's not really implemented in browsers as far as I can tell.
Okay. They do have some polyfills that are listed in the proposal.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's an object in
Hmm.
JavaScript. It's a namespace in JavaScript, so you can
Yeah.
definitely polyfill it. But some of these polyfills. First of all, I haven't checked how complete these polyfills are, and
Yeah. The
it's yeah.
README says so it was updated. Oh, that's helpful. It says it was updated last year. Very, very helpful. It does list other changes 2 months and 4 months ago, so it might be longer ago than that. But the two that it lists are at JS temporal / polyfill, which I'm assuming is an npm package, and that says that the alpha release is available, and then temporal - polyfill, which is a full calendar implementation, it says the beta release is available. So it might be worth looking at, but yeah, it doesn't look like any of these are entirely stable.
Now we've effectively run out of time. I was going to talk about two more. One is the explicit resource management with the using keyword. It's this one actually does modify JavaScript semantics. I did actually discuss it way back in episode 590 a year and a half ago. It was stage 3 then. It's still stage 3 now. The one interesting thing is that TypeScript actually added it in version 5.2 about a year and a half ago. So it seems that TypeScript kind of jumped the gun on that one. They saw it in stage 3. They assumed it was going to be released soon, and so they added support for it. But it's not here yet. So it exists in TypeScript, but not in JavaScript, which is amusing.
Yep. I just
Um,
posted a link to that episode as well.
yeah. And the other one is something with this really cool name called Shadow Realm. I guess we'll need to find a different episode to talk about that one. It's that one is currently in stage 2.7, which means it's not even stage 3. But
Sounds
it's really,
good.
yeah. Um, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe if we get requests from our audience to do it, is to do another episode about JavaScript features stuck in purgatory. There are a whole bunch of really, yeah, there are a whole bunch of really interesting JavaScript features that have been stage 2 for like what feels like forever. I wonder if it's worthwhile to actually even talk about them because, on the one hand, some of them are really cool and really interesting, and they add a lot of really interesting twists to the JavaScript language. But on the other hand, seems like they're just stuck there. So the committee is not really doing away with them, but they're also not progressing them. They're kind of stuck. I wonder if it's worthwhile to even talk about them. What do you think?
I think that would definitely be interesting. It's also interesting sometimes. How do I put it? There are things that kind of float out there for a while. I'll go back to the legislative example, right? Because I mentioned laws passing and bills passing and stuff. There are things that get proposed like every year that just never quite get enough traction, and sometimes what's needed is somebody just points it out, and then all of a sudden some energy comes up behind it, and things move. And so I'm imagining that I don't know that we have that kind of influence necessarily, but it could start the process so that other folks start talking about it too, and we get some exposure as far as, oh, this really is a good idea and we ought to just go and finish it, right? Whether that's maybe we modify it to solve some of the concerns, or there's a little bit more work put into just putting the polish on it or whatever, and then we get another cool thing in JavaScript.
Yeah, and I would imagine that AJ would be really happy that they're not here yet, or not here maybe forever.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, yeah, I mean, all of this stuff's really, really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing more and more people use some of these features.
Yeah, all the features that we spoke about today are effectively in the language, so
Mhm.
there is absolutely no reason not to use them. And in fact, as I explained, in some cases it's preferable to use them rather than the alternatives. So, as an example, again, instead of dot reverse, use to reversed.
To
That's
reverse.
like a prime example of something that we should use. Or another one, if you're doing all sorts of mathematical operations with unions, then maybe instead of using some npm package, you just use what's now built into the JavaScript language itself.
Yep. So I did a search on Shadow Realm, and it looks like there's a Twilight, something Twilight. I think it's D&D book that's called Shadow Realm, and then there were like 18 of the front page links were Yu-Gi-Oh,
Okay.
the card game. So
In other words,
anyway,
it must be a cool JavaScript feature if it's called Shadow Realm. I mean, you have
right?
to admit the name is really cool.
Yep. So anyway, but yeah, I'd love to dive into some of these features. Yeah, some of the ones that are in limbo or purgatory or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, but it's also good to just see some of this stuff come along. And like you said, none of these are huge changes, but some of these sure seem like they'd make my coding either more stable or easier to do. And so I'm all about that. So all right, well, let's go ahead and do our picks. Do you want to do picks first, or do you want me to go first?
I can go first.
All right.
So first of all, people who are listening might have noticed that I've got a bit of a head cold and a stuffy nose. Hopefully that goes away. So my first pick would be for my head cold to go away.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's not really such a huge bother, it's just annoying. So that would be my first pick. My second pick is we actually had a fun day today at work. The team that I'm mostly working with, we went out together to play laser tag, which was a lot of fun. So my second pick would be to have fun days as team building exercises, and the third pick would be to do a laser tag game because it's just fun. And those would be my picks for today. Short and sweet.
Yep, laser tag is fun. I'm gonna pick. It's a second version of a board game I've picked in the past. So I've picked Machi Koro in the past, and essentially, just to give you an overview of Machi Koro, essentially you're building a town. You buy buildings, and then you roll dice, and you get money based on whether it's somebody else's team or your team, and whether you have a card with that number on it. And then you buy landmarks, and once you've built all 4 landmarks, you win. That's Machi Koro. Machi Koro 2 is a little bit different. So instead of building 4 landmarks, you only have to build 3. But the other thing is that in Machi Koro, you put out all the different types of buildings you can build in your town. In Machi Koro 2, what you do is you have decks of cards that have numbers 1 through 6, decks of cards that have numbers 7 through 12, and then you have landmarks. And so you flip cards over until you have basically 5 unique buildings in each row, and then you win when you build 3 landmarks. And so you play, the rest of the game plays the same. You roll the dice. If you have the building, you get paid. The landmarks in Machi Koro, the original, have fixed pricing for each landmark. In Machi Koro 2, your first landmark has a cost, your second landmark has a cost, your third landmark has a cost, and those costs are on the card. I mean, those are the only differences. The rest of the game plays the same. It does give you a little bit more variety, and it makes the strategy just slightly a little bit more. You really have to think about it a little extra in order to get what you want, because the cards do give you different abilities, but it's not such a wide breadth of abilities that you're going, oh man, I don't know how to figure this game out. So we played it with some friends of ours. We got it for Christmas. My family did. And it's Board Game Geek has a weight of 1.48, so it's still a pretty simple game. I think Machi Koro is like 1.3. So yeah, very, very approachable, simple game. Says age 10 plus can play it. My daughter's 9. I think she'd be fine playing this game. It says playtime's 45 minutes. I'm not sure if I remember how long it took us. Probably about that long. So anyway, it's a fun game if you're looking for just something short, not terribly complicated, that you can play and kind of chat over the table while you play it.
Chuck, I'm kind of curious, since you're such a board game geek / expert. If you had to name your top board game, or at least one of your top board games, just out of curiosity,
Oof.
what would that be?
Um,
One in the top 3 or top 5, please.
So that's a little bit tricky just because there's so many kinds of board games.
Yeah, but there must be something you really like,
So the ones
especially
that
like.
I've been playing a bunch lately, and I can give you a couple of them. I've already picked them on the show.
No,
One of them
obviously,
is,
I'm just curious which
yeah,
one you like the most.
I'd really have to think about that. Like I said, the ones that we've been playing lately that we're really liking are Mysterium. We got expansion for that. It doesn't change the gameplay at all. It's just more cards. We got 2 expansions. The other one that we've been playing lately is Betrayal at House on the Hill. I should put links to these in here. And that one's a fun one. It's relatively fast too, but it's more of a role play game almost. The idea is you're a group of people that come into a haunted house, and you explore the house, and eventually a haunting happens, and you're trying to complete goals. One of you frequently becomes the traitor, almost always, not always, but almost always. One of you becomes the traitor, and then everybody's playing against that other player. And the thing that's fun about it is that the scenario you wind up playing changes from game to game. And so the as you explore a room, you place tiles for the rooms, and so your map changes every game too. And so there's a lot to like about that. Honestly, sometimes I really, really like the kind of the thinker games. I'm not. So some of the big ones that people tend to like that I'm not a fan of are like Seven Wonders, or there are some of them where you're almost playing your own game, and then at the end you see who played it the best. But you do interact with each other as far as, did I do better at you with this than that? But then you've got other games. I'm trying to think. We've been playing Risk Legacy, which I like, but I don't love. With my friends, we played Heat, and I think I
Problem with
mentioned that
Risk
earlier.
is that played properly, it can take such a long time.
Yeah, and we're getting to the stage with Risk Legacy. So Risk Legacy modifies the board every time and has special rules for how you win. And so it doesn't take as long. But the last time we played it, it's starting to get to the point where you really almost have to do world domination to win the round. And so it does take quite a bit longer.
How
Yeah, I
about
tend to like
Catan?
Settlers of Catan. That was one of the games that I kind of got into board gaming on. But anymore, it's like there are so many games that just have better mechanisms in them. And so,
Yeah, if somebody likes Catan and wants a better alternative, what would you recommend? Or you need to think about it.
yeah, I do. Let me. I'll
So
I'll come back next time with my top
yeah,
2 or 3 games.
that'll be your homework for next time.
Yeah, but I will tell you that, yeah, for the social games, we're really liking Mysterium. If you want a lighter social game, things like Sushi Go Party are fun. If you're looking at like maps and things like that, I mean, there are games out there. I kind of have this nostalgic feel for Axis and Allies, but that's another one that takes like 3 or 4 hours to play. Yeah, there are a bunch of good ones out there. Let me think about that, and I'll come back to it. But
to be honest, I don't see myself playing a board game for 6 hours.
yeah, the ones that I like, they take you about an hour and a half, and you have some idea about where you're at as far as like, am I winning or not? But you don't entirely know, because there's always some twist that, and so somebody could be building towards something and you don't really see it until they resolve it. And then you go, oh, wow. Right. But then you turn around and you resolve your thing on the next turn. And then everybody goes, oh, now he's,
Yeah.
so those are the kinds that I like. And the ones where I have enough room to get creative on the strategy, right? Where there's not just kind of a tried and true, if you do this every time, you're going to win.
Play Go.
Yeah, Go is a good example of that, with fairly simple rules. So anyway, other picks. My wife and I started watching Prison Break, which is an older TV show on
Oh
Netflix.
yeah, that's an old one. That's from the 90s, I think.
I think it's early 2000s, but still, yeah, I've been liking that. I'm still watching. I have the last season of, what's it called? Reacher? No, not Reacher. Jack Ryan. I've been watching that.
Yeah, I tried to watch it. I couldn't really get into it. I actually read some of the what's his name? Clancy, I think he wrote.
Yeah,
I
the
read
Tom
some of
Clancy
the
books.
yeah, I read some of the Tom Clancy books. I could never actually get into either the movies or the TV shows. I don't know.
Yeah. There are older movies too. Hunt for Red October is a terrific book.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's his best one, I think.
Yeah, I've read a few others of his books, but the TV show is not based on any of the books.
Oh yeah,
Like
for sure.
They just pulled some of the characters out, and they basically have a new threat every season. That said, it's not the best ever kind of action spy TV show that I've ever seen, but I'm enjoying it.
If you've got Peacock, I actually picked it a while back, but it might be nice for you to watch. If you've got Peacock, I don't know who has Peacock, but
I do.
maybe. Then it's Day of the Jackal.
Yeah, you recommended that a few weeks ago, and that's kind of on my list. But yeah, anyway, so I've been watching that. I'm in the middle right now, and I'm going to pick these books again. I'm on book like 9 or 10 of the Sword of Truth books, and they are so good. I've gotten, so I read them in high school, and then I hadn't really touched them again, and he put out more books. The author had passed away a few years ago, but he wrote like
Terry
15 books
Goodkin
in
did.
this. Yeah,
I recall reading some of his stuff. I'm trying to remember what. I didn't
those
know
were
he
his
passed away.
big series. But yeah,
Yeah, I see. He died 5 years ago.
2020. Yeah, but anyway, I've just been really, really enjoying these books, and so yeah, I'll pick those as well. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling at this point because you derailed me with the question about board games, but yeah, and then just working on getting JavaScript Geniuses and the AI Bootcamp roll it out. So yeah. Anyway, I guess we'll wrap it up because I am not going to keep rambling about this stuff. But yeah, till next time, folks, Max out.